My name is Alessandra Moctezuma, and I'm the gallery director here and also professor in museum studies and in Chicano art. Actually, this morning I brought my Chicano art class to see the exhibit. And we had just been talking in class about the Mexican Revolution. And we were looking at the work of the great muralists Siqueiros, Orozco, and Rivera, and how they had depicted not only the revolution and the violence that ensued, but also the struggle of people, and many of them farm workers, who were trying to fight for better conditions, better wages, and also who led lives of basically indentured servitude. And we talked about that, and we saw some images by the muralists, and it was such a powerful segue to come and see the exhibit Living Under the Trees and see the photographs that David Bacon has been taking over the last few years that show us that unfortunately things still need to improve. And so I've known about David Bacon's work for several years now, and I myself as an artist and being raised in Los Angeles with mentors like Chicano muralist Judith Baca, I was always inspired by the utilization of art as a tool for change. And I see that is so evident in David's work. And I think also a message that has to come across to our students and our larger audience is that the art is the starting point, is the beginning of the sentence, that we really have to complete it, and that we have to play a role also and find out how we can contribute and help change some of these policies. So this evening, before David speaks, I would like to introduce Dorothy Johnson, who's a lawyer with California Rural Legal Assistance. And David worked very closely with them during this project. And also I wanted, after she talks, I wanted to invite Fred Lonadier, who's also a photographer, activist, and professor at UCSD, to come up here and introduce David Bacon. I thank all of you for joining us this evening. I also want to say thanks to all my students in museum studies who helped put together this exhibit, because it's really a collaboration and it's really about a team effort. We took the previous show down last Thursday, so we did all this in a week. So I wanted to thank them for that, and we couldn't do it without them. So let me ask Dorothy Johnson to please come up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessandra, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight and for inviting CRLA to participate in this wonderful event and the very nice reception. We appreciate it very much. David Bacon and I actually first met 30 years ago, approximately. We were both very, very young, and we both were working for the United Farm Workers Union in Coachella during a very historic period in the union's time, and that because that was during the first elections that were held for farm workers under the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. So it's been a lot of fun for me to reconnect with David through this project, and it's been appreciated as well. California Rural Legal Assistance is a nonprofit law firm established in 1965. So we've been around for a long time. We have about 22 offices up and down the state of California. Our office here is in Oceanside, and we have offices in places like El Centro and Coachella, California, and up in areas like Fresno and Marysville and Salinas. We primarily serve the agricultural community, and we provide free legal assistance to eligible clients in such areas as education, employment, housing, public benefits, and civil rights. Just as art can be a tool for change, so can law, and we do a lot of education and outreach among the immigrant communities around California, and in our case, particularly in North County, educating people about their rights and then helping them when they want to go forward and enforce those rights. And Alessandra asked me to communicate with you tonight about some of the ways that you all might, that people who are interested might be able to help promote the kind of work that we do, and help make changes in the circumstances that David's going to show to you. And I think one of the things that I would like to suggest is that people start speaking up. We've got such incredible anti-immigrant sentiment right now throughout the country, and particularly in North County, and I suspect in the rest of the county as well. Up in North County, we have a lot of activity by the San Diego Minutemen and other extreme groups who don't view immigrants as human beings, but instead lump everyone together in really a very racist and bigoted attack. So I hope when you see, I think that this exhibition is very important because it puts a face on immigrants, and when we see who immigrants are, what they're trying to do, that immigrants have the same goals and aspirations as all of the rest of us, maybe that helps diffuse the level of animosity created by the right-wing extremists. So I hope that would be one thing that I would hope would come out of this, that when you observe the exhibition and when you see things in the newspaper about what the city of Escondido wants to do to keep undocumented folks from renting apartments or even living in apartments, or when you see what various communities are doing with day laborers, that you think about speaking out for those people.
Good evening. I am Fred Lanadier. I'm one of the two photographers in the Visual Arts Department at UC San Diego. I'm also the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Local 2034, and I have been involved as well in cross-border things, particularly with workers in the maquiladoras, where probably I got to know David the most, even though we'd actually known each other off and on through back a number of years. But we would run into each other photographing down there, and that makes sense with this exhibit because, in fact, both of us are photographers of the working class. David's work has been far more international than mine. He has done work on the workers in Iraq. So shortly after the invasion and the occupation, David was over there interviewing and photographing the workers there. And I think that's the important point to keep in mind, that where workers actually work is wherever they are, they're very often part of a worldwide nexus of shipping companies, capital, and so on. And that's absolutely as true of these workers that you see on the walls of the gallery tonight. In fact, if you go down 6 or 8 hours south of Ensenada to San Quintin, you will see their relatives. And if you had strawberries this morning, probably a 20% chance that they came from San Quintin. And in another month or two, hundreds and hundreds of truckloads of tomatoes, strawberries will be coming up there. And now there's this border, and the mobility of these workers is much, much more difficult than what it used to be. But the point, I think, is to come back to understanding this as a partial view of a total worldwide system that's extremely exploitative, and either bringing workers in or allowing workers in to do certain kinds of work or take the work to them. We had the period of great immigration period in the 19th and early 20th century from Asia and then from Southern and Eastern Europe. Now what you do is you take the factory to them and whatever works easiest and best, but the conditions are awful. Labor rights standards are negligible. But we are people who can do something about it, and as Alessandra's point was, the point of doing these kinds of things, of getting these images out to humanize these people, make connections with them, allows us to have some leverage with their struggle, and they are absolutely people in struggle. Without too much further ado, I'd like to introduce David. As I said, he's really a kind of a crossover figure as an artist. He began doing farm labor organizing after he got kicked out of UC Berkeley for the free speech struggle years ago, and worked his way into journalism, and then took, in a community college, took some photo classes and began to develop that and began to work a practice where the picture started accompanying the things. And that's a very different division of labor, because typically the journalist does the writing, the photographer does the photography, but in this case David is in control of the whole thing. And he, in the last few years, has moved more and more of that into exhibition in art spaces, union halls, and so on. And this is all to the good. And so I congratulate him on his exhibit tonight, and can't wait to hear what he has to say. The only other connection I have with David, I learned rather late, just maybe a couple of years ago, that he had been very, very good friends with a cousin of mine who lives in Seattle, Bill Core. So without further ado, David Bacon.
Well, thanks for coming out tonight, and thanks for coming over to the gallery. And I want to thank also the cooks who cooked those tamales. They were really, really, really good. And to Alessandra and to all of you who worked on taking the old show down and putting the new show up, your work was really appreciated. It looks really, really beautiful. I'm just really proud and happy that it's in that space, and you did a fabulous job, so thank you very much. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the images and show some of them to you as far as we can get, without taking too much time, and also read from some of the interviews. There were actually a whole lot of interviews that were part of this project. 6 of them wound up on the wall there. But there are a lot more where they came from, and someday, I guess every photographer dreams of having twice as many images on the wall, and I also dream of having 2 or 3 times as many oral histories or testimonies as the ones that are there. Before I do that, though, I wanted to tell you a funny story about Dorothy. Well, it wasn't about Dorothy, it was about me, really. Dorothy was my first teacher as an organizer. In fact, the first people I ever organized, really, I was working for her. She was my supervisor. And so I had just started as a young organizer for the farm workers and had stopped doing legal work and had begun trying to work as an organizer. And so I was sent out to talk to a crew of people picking tangerines over by the Salton Sea. And I had my cards with me to sign up everybody up on cards so that we could have an election there and win the election. And so I was just this young white guy, and I hardly spoke Spanish. And so I went out there, and the workers were kind of friendly. It was lunchtime, and they were happy. And so they started signing cards left and right and left and right. And, everybody in the crew signed up, I was so proud. I went back to the union office, and when we had our meeting after work, I handed Dorothy my cards and made this big thing in the meeting about how I'd signed up the whole crew. And Dorothy looked at the card and she said, "Vicente Fernandez is working in this crew." So the workers, they had, their little joke on me was that they had signed the cards with the names of these famous Mexican singers. So it was a little lesson in humility there. But actually, they did eventually all sign up for real, and we won the election there, David Valdora. And David Valdora is in that movie, Fighting for Your Lives. If you ever see this movie about the Farm Workers Union, it's a real exciting movie, and he was one of the evil growers that we went on strike against in 1973. At any rate, this project also grew out of another project that came before it, which was called Communities Without Borders. And Communities Without Borders was an attempt to try and look at migration of people. And I'm saying migration rather than immigration because immigration is a very US-centric word. Because really it means that we're looking at people once they cross the border and they're here. You know, if you were Mexican and you were sitting in Mexico and you were talking about, you would say immigration because that means people leaving or going out. But the reality is it's a process, right? So we ought to really call it migration. And this book looks at the whole process, and it looks at the fact that for indigenous people coming from states like Oaxaca, Mixtecos or Zapotecos or Triquis or people coming from other areas, people leave Oaxaca as farm workers and they come to first to other places in Mexico. Fred was talking about San Quintin, for instance, or Maniadero, which is right near Ensenada. And so workers come up and they work as farm workers in those areas. And over the years, people settle down, or at least some people do. And so you can go to San Quintin and you'll find a little settlement called Nuevo San Juan Copala. And Nuevo San Juan Copala means New San Juan Copala, and it's named after San Juan Copala, which is one of the main towns in the Triqui community in Oaxaca. And then you can cross the border and you can wind up in Greenfield, California, where there are 3,000 Triquis living. And Greenfield could be called Nuevo San Juan Copala because of the people who are living there. The main thing, though, is that if you come from San Juan Copala, you can go to all of these places and you'll find family members and friends, and you can eat the food that you're accustomed to, and you can speak your language, and you can do the dances that belong to your community and participate in the culture. And it's like you belong to a community that exists in more than one place. And you can move from place to place and you're still part of the same community. And those are called transnational communities. And this is what this book documents. So after doing this book, then what we decided to do was to look at the communities of indigenous Mexican farm workers here in California, to kind of focus in more closely on those communities here, and without so much thinking about the communities that people are coming from. As in this book, there are photographs, for instance, from Oaxaca and from Guatemala and from people's towns of origin. This project really just looks at the communities that are here, but tries to look at it kind of more closely. And I say we because this kind of art or this kind of project is a collective project. Nobody can do it by themselves. You know, I couldn't have gone out to the hillsides in Del Mar or Carlsbad without Mario. And Mario was very generous. He said, you know, I helped David, but in reality, it was very much of a cooperative project. And we also had other people with us because we needed translators for some of the languages that people were speaking. And so there was a guy with us who was able to speak in Mixteco and Triqui to the workers who were there. And so all of us together were able to establish enough of a communication with the workers so that we could explain what the purpose of the project was and why we were there. And they agreed that we could take the photographs and talk to them, and eventually interviewed some of the people living there. And that's the way this project developed. There's one other organization as well that was part of it, and that was the Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales, or the Indigenous Front of Binational Organizations, which is an organization of indigenous people from Oaxaca and other states with chapters both here in the US and in Mexico. And that organization also participated in this project. And you can see in the photographs, in some of the photographs, leaders of that organization, like there's one of Jose Gonzalez here in San Diego, who lives here in San Diego. And there's a photograph of, well, why should I tell you without looking at the photographs? So let's look at the pictures. So So we're going to kind of start looking at these photographs, sort of generally speaking, moving from south to north. So here is, how old do you think she is? This young woman here. Well, she told me 18. I don't believe it either. Workers know what to tell you, right? And so if you're some white guy with a camera out there, people think, well, I don't want to get myself in trouble or the guy that hired me necessarily, so I'll tell you what the legal thing is. But I think she was about 13 years old, actually. And the thing about this picture is that this is on an onion bagging machine, right? So it's not uncommon to see families working out in the fields topping the onions because kids will come out and work with their families after school or on the weekends, and that's a pretty common experience in farm worker families, but not on the machine. The grower is not going to put somebody on a machine who's not going to stay there all day and work there all day. There's no business of, I'm going to work for 2 hours and then my friend is going to come and work for 2 hours on the machine. You have to be there. So that means that she was working there all day, which means that she wasn't going to school because this was on a Friday. So these are photographs of kind of like people working in the onions here. This guy is working at night. This picture was taken about midnight. And people working in topping onions work 24 hours, more or less. So this is, I had an interesting conversation with Mario, in fact, with a number of people about this photograph here, because this is a guy sleeping in the field, kind of resting for a few hours in the rows before going back to work. So originally I didn't want to show this picture because of what? The beer can, right? The first reaction looking at this picture is, guy is drunk. Or this is some, irresponsible person. And then, you think about what's in the picture and who he is, and he's obviously a worker in an onion field, especially because I'm telling you that this is where I took the picture. And so then you think to yourself, well, then why did he drink a beer? What was the point of drinking a beer and then going to sleep in the field? And the answer is, we don't know, right? At least not without interviewing him, and he was asleep and I didn't interview him. But, it could be maybe, for instance, that he needed something to take the edge off so that he could sleep for a while. Because, again, he's working probably 18, 19 hours a day. This is all piece rate. Or it could be that he's kind of like not very happy and having a beer and going to sleep is a way of getting away from it. We don't know, but I think that, in a way, to me, the beer can makes you start, or should make you start asking questions of yourself and who this person is and what it's doing, and kind of get beyond the initial reaction of what it is. And the initial reaction ought to tell us something too, because it's like when you see pictures of homeless people, there's part of our culture that wants you to look at it and say, God, it's his own fault. Whatever is wrong with him, he did it to himself. And so, again, the object of the photograph is to, in a way, kind of get you to think about that one and ask yourself, well, is it? So this is in a different field, and this is right at sundown, and this one is just trying to, well, partly it's just because the light was really beautiful at the end of the day. And then it's also trying to take a look at what the work process is like. And so, and again, part of what's going on here is how close you are. When you're topping onions, you're right down there in the dirt. You're not standing up. This isn't like bunches of grapes hanging down from a lattice or something. This is, right down in the middle of the dirt, which means that whatever is on those onions, you're breathing, you're coming into very intimate contact with. So I want to read some of the oral histories that people gave me, because I think that they're it's not only that they're moving, which they are, but I think it's also they tell you a lot about the variety of experiences that people want to talk about. And so this is Cuauhtemoc Martinez, and I interviewed him in Lamont. And he says, I'm 17 in the 11th grade, and my favorite subjects in school are math and science. I take calculus and chemistry. I also play basketball and run cross country in the mile. I usually run long distance. I'd like to get a doctorate degree in astronomy and study the cosmos. I've been here 6 years, since 1999. I lived and worked in Ciudad Juarez for 8 years with my grandmother and decided to come here when I was 11. In my family, we speak Triqui and Spanish, and at that time, I didn't speak any English. I didn't know how to read or write either. Now I speak all 3 languages, and I'm learning French. I've really progressed. Now I'm one of the top students in school. It was very difficult when I first arrived because I had to write and I couldn't. I practiced a lot. And in the 8th grade, I knew English well and I started to like math and I learned to read, and now here I am. I feel I did it alone. About 98% of the students in my school come from migrant families. I think immigrants need more resources. It's difficult because there are very few computers, for instance, in our school and too many students who need to use them. I stay after school to use the computers in the library, but I have to wait in line for 2 hours sometimes. And teachers now require the work to be done by computer, and now I need one because I write so many research papers. I would say that there's discrimination against students who come from immigrant families because of the California high school exit exam. Many of the students who have just arrived in this country are forced to take the exam before graduating high school, but the Constitution states that every child has a right to education. After high school, I want to go to the university, to Cal Poly. It's a good school with a good astronomy program. There are trees and mountains, and it's close to the sea. I want to start my family when I'm 25 after I have a job. My favorite language is still Triqui. It's something that we need to preserve. I'd like to help the Triqui community by writing a book in Triqui. But before you learn how to write it, you have to understand the meaning of all the words. We still have no written form of Triqui, so you have to know the origin of the words and the history of them. I think maybe after we talk for a while, or I've finished talking for a while, we might want to talk about what the relationship is between words and images and why this project consists of both oral histories and the images and what the importance is of people's voice. But that's definitely, to me, a very, very important part of this documentation project. So here we are in San Diego, and this is Carlsbad, right? Las Gallinitas? And this is really, to me, is about 2 things, this photograph. One is rich and poor. It's about the, kind of upper middle class house and the housing project that they're building on top of the hill, and then what it's like especially for very recent migrants crossing the border, living here on the hillside. But it's also about the kind of precarious nature of these settlements, because they're always threatened by development. So, if enough houses get built, and you can see where they're going to put in more houses up there, eventually that the people who live in those houses are going to start complaining to the sheriffs about the people living below in the ravine. And the sheriffs are going to come along and chase people off, which is what's happened in other parts of the county where people are living in this kind of situation. And that's not to say anything about the Minutemen and other people who also come after these workers. So it's it's not just about the poor living conditions, but it's also about the insecure nature of it. You don't know really from 1 month to the next whether you're really going to be able to continue living where you are. And this is in Del Mar, and this is in the ravine that's down below the hillside where a lot of people live. And I think that this photograph and this one, what they're about is, well, here, and this one too. So if you're living in this, on the hillside in this home here, or if you're taking care of your child in a tent on the hillside there, how do you wash up after work? If you're taking care of a kid, how do you give your kid a bath? How do you cook? You know, all the things that we sort of do as urban people without really thinking about it too much. All of this requires much more work and much more conscious thought. So, you know, it's not just, again, that conditions are not good. You know, you think about what's in that creek. You know, how clean is the water? If it's runoff water from the fields, what chemicals are in it? This also happens to farm workers a lot. You know, washing up after work in irrigation ditches or in canals like this. But it's also every kind of daily function that you think about that you normally go through life. What about brushing your teeth? You know, it's just all becomes much more work. This is a young guy who got sick. And, you know, so it's also just a portrait. And this is what I was going to tell you about. This is Jose Gonzalez from the Frente Indígena, and this is the day before the May Day March here in San Diego in 2006. And so he's basically talking to workers at the bottom of the hillside where people live, where the lunch trucks come and sell food to people, and basically urging people to come out for the May Day March. So, you know, because people live in very precarious situations doesn't mean that people are not social actors, that they don't participate in political organizations and political movements. A lot of those workers did come out for those immigrant rights marches, trying to talk about their right to driver's licenses or to immigration amnesty and trying to change the world. In fact, I think that among migrants and among people living in transnational communities, one of the most interesting questions is, what community are you a citizen of? In other words, the same folks who are going to go to that march the day after here in San Diego, some of them also belong to communities where they voted in the election in last July in Mexican national elections. So how many of them voted in the election, and what would happen if the law in Mexico that says that people have the right to vote who are living here in the United States, what if it was actually fully implemented so that all the people living on the hillside voted? Who would they vote for? And people have been fighting for that right to vote here in the United States and to participate in the elections in Mexico. So people think of themselves in many cases as being political activists in the United States and in Mexico both. This is another picture of political activity. And this is what makes it fun too. This was Mario doing his job. So while we went out there to take the photographs, and here these are workers who are living on the hillside and who have questions about mostly about labor rights, and Mario's answering people's questions and talking to them. And this guy here in the middle there is the guy that runs one of the lunch trucks that sells workers food at the bottom of the hill. A lot of these photographs are also about culture, people's culture, because culture, I think, is a survival tool. It's one of the things that helps people to live and survive in conditions that are sometimes very difficult, and part of people's culture is religion. And so this is a place where people celebrated the Mass at the bottom of the hill, and this was also a place that was burned out by the Minutemen and destroyed by the Minutemen. So now we're moving over to the Coachella Valley and a different community of indigenous people, Purépechas from Michoacán. And so there's a whole large community of indigenous people from Michoacán, Purépechas, living in Coachella Valley, and mostly in two huge trailer parks, Chicanitas and Duros. And this is a picture of one of those trailer parks, and just to sort of give you a sense of what it's like. As you can see, we're sort of in the middle of the desert here, and there's a lot of dust. And one of the problems, health problems, that's very common among farm worker kids is asthma, and I think a lot of it comes from simply living very close to the dirt and having to breathe the dust all the time. Especially for migrants, not just for indigenous people, But for migrants in general, people who travel with the crops, in California, there's really no housing. And so when this harvest comes in Coachella, you find people like Justino here living in a van, or you find people sleeping in parking lots next to their cars. And partly it's because growers don't want to be responsible for people's housing any longer. They tore down the labor camps that they used to have up until the 1970s. In the 1970s, most of the labor camps in California were torn down, but that didn't necessarily mean the workers disappeared, obviously. It just meant that they didn't have any place to live any longer. I mean, I remember organizing workers in those labor camps and thinking about how bad they were at the time. But you know, I think you have to ask yourself if this is better. Okay, this is another one. This is Oscar Eduardo Buenaval Nunez, and I interviewed him in Healdsburg. And so he says, I come from Santiago Chazumba, between Oaxaca and Puebla. My grandmother taught us to speak Mixteco, but it was difficult to hold on to our language working and trying to survive. Our ancestors left us these beautiful traditions, and it's important to maintain them. My parents rented land to grow vegetables, but it was very frustrating seeing my family suffer because there wasn't enough food. We had to kill animals like rabbits to survive. So my childhood wasn't like the other children's because I just thought of work. But that experience helped me in raising my own family and being able to provide for them, and it gives me strength to keep going. I knew I needed to come to the U.S. when my wife was pregnant. I didn't know if we'd have enough money to welcome this new child into the world. I had to borrow from a moneylender in my hometown, so I borrowed 20,000 pesos and paid 2,000 pesos monthly. My mother co-signed and used our home as a guarantee. If I couldn't pay, my mother wouldn't have a place to live, and my pregnant wife wouldn't have anywhere to stay. It was a lot of pressure. Then we paid 3,000 pesos when my wife delivered. I've been here 7 months, and my son is now 5 months old. I don't know him yet. I wasn't there when he was born. As a parent, the one thing you want most is to be with your child and hold him. I don't even like to call my wife because my son starts cooing and I'm embarrassed that I can't send them money. I send them $50 a week, but it's not enough. My wife tells me that the money isn't the most important thing and that she wishes I could spend time with my son, but they need to eat. I have a lot of pride and I can't leave because I haven't met my goals. I would like to visit my family without having to cross with coyotes, but if I went to see my son, I would have to pay almost $3,500 to come back here. Sometimes I only work 1 day a week. There are a lot of farm workers out of work, so we all stand around the shopping center. We have an organized system here with all of our names on a list. We're all guaranteed at least 1 day of work a week, but it's just enough to survive and pay the rent. This country is calm and beautiful, but I wouldn't want to live here all my life. As a Mexican, I feel less than others sometimes because so many people say that we came to take away their jobs and land. But if you think about it, this was our land before, so we aren't invading anyone. I think that if anyone should be mad, it should be us. So this is another important part of this project, again, is documenting the kinds of things that people do to change conditions. And obviously this is one of the most important ones, and that is organizing unions. And so this is the organizing drive that took place the year that we were doing this project in Delano at a big grape growing ranch. And here's Yolanda Serna doing what we were taught as organizers not to do, which is preaching to the choir. Because if you look at who's she talking to, you know, one of the women there has the red hat with the black eagle on it, which means that, you know, and she's working, right? So she's obviously, as we used to say in the union, de hueso colorado, which means you are 100% for the union. Even if your foreman's going to get mad at you, you're not going to let that stop you. So Yolanda is not talking to people who are sitting on the fence, as she should be, you know, trying to get them to come over to the union. So actually, I think what Yolanda was doing there is another common thing that organizers have to do, and that is she's getting from them the names of other workers in the crew who need to be talked to after work at home, maybe, and, you know, having somebody go and see them. At any rate, it's this is kind of like, this is what organizing farm workers really looks like a lot. This is Vaselia Valadez working in the grapes in Raisin City. And this is sometimes, you know, there are photographs that you take just because you love the light. And to me, this is another one of those, because this is another early morning one where the light's just sort of coming almost sideways across the tops of the grapevines and just coming down the side of her face. And it's, sometimes when you work out in the fields, it's not all depressing. When you're out there working, I think that early in the morning, with seeing the mountains around you, and sometimes it's very beautiful. This is in Selma. This is another very common living condition for farm workers, which is a lot of people having to live in one small space. So here you can count in this shot, there are 4 beds, and I'm standing on another one, so that's 5. The other thing I love about this picture is the 3 TVs. Everybody gets to watch their own program. And this is just a portrait of Emilio Lopez and his wife. And one of the most important parts of indigenous culture is dance. And in Oaxaca, there's a big dance festival every year, the Guelaguetza, which started out as sort of like a popular festival, and then the state government in Oaxaca kind of took it over. And it's partly for tourists and partly as just a popular expression of people's culture. In 2006, the year that we were taking these pictures, there was no Guelaguetza in Oaxaca because of the teacher strike and the big uprising that took place. And Zocalo, where you would normally have the Guelaguetza, was full of tear gas and rocks and police, going after people. In California, we had 6 Guelaguetzas, right? Los Angeles, Vista, Fresno, Santa Cruz, a couple of other places as well too, which says something about how many people from Oaxaca are living in California, that there are enough dance groups, for instance, to be able to actually support those festivals. But they're also very, very beautiful. And Kenia Lopez here was chosen as the queen of the Primavera the year after this Guelaguetza, and came to our exhibition in Fresno when we opened the show at Arte Americas and danced for us. So this is also, Kenya was born in Oaxaca, but I think she came here when she was 3 or 4. So she learned to dance here, not in Oaxaca. And this is an important fact because it's part of how people keep their culture and preserve their culture and their language. And you try and pass it on to your children. And one of the vehicles that many indigenous groups from Oaxaca are using to do this is setting up dance groups for young people, and which also sort of turn into language lessons and culture lessons. And this is another part of the Guelaguetza. This is the Danza de los Diablos. And this one I really love. This is the Fresno has a lot of people from one town, San Miguel Cuevas, and on the Saints' Day of San Miguel Cuevas, on St. Michael's Day, there's a community celebration. And it starts off with setting up an altar in somebody's garage in this sort of working class neighborhood in Fresno. And then about 7 o'clock in the morning, the band comes and they play Las Mañanitas. And so you wonder what the neighbors think when they hear the horns starting to go off at 7 o'clock in the morning. But it's very kind of beautiful. And these are just kids learning to dance. So this is the oral history of Bernardina Diaz. And she has a pretty remarkable history. She says, I was born in Oaxaca in San Martin Perras. 18 years ago, I got married, but my husband left us when my children were very young, so I left San Martin to work and took all my daughters with me. In Culiacan, we worked in tomato fields and cutting pines. My children were small, and I had to work very hard to feed them. We all lived in a single room. The pay was just enough to buy food. We didn't have enough money for shoes, and we would come every 4 months to work the tomato crop. When the work was over, we returned home, and when we ran out of money, we went to work again. I wanted my daughters to go to school. In Mazatlan, where I harvested potatoes, there was a school, but I didn't speak Spanish, and I had no way to register them, and then people laughed at us because we spoke Mixteco. Then I spent 6 years working in Lázaro Cárdenas in the cucumber. Lázaro Cárdenas is in Baja California. Tomato and squash harvest. My daughters finally went to school, but I still didn't have enough money to feed them. They said it paid better here in the U.S., so I borrowed money and we left on a bus. In Sonora, we crossed on foot with a relative who knew the way. We walked 5 nights and 3 days. We ran out of water and food and ate plants like spinach that we found in the desert. It was September and really hot. Here in Oxnard, someone traveling with us knew a place to stay. Then one of my daughter's teachers helped us to find this room for rent. We pay $500 and an extra $50 for gas to use the kitchen. 13 people live in the house, all from different places. Now 2 of the girls work and the others go to school. My daughters say my biggest accomplishment is bringing them here. Our checks come to $200 a week, which is not enough. We can't afford to send money home because I have to send the girls to school and buy food. Sometimes we can't even pay the rent. Each year we go to Salinas for 4 months, but it costs $60 for our ride. That's $360 for all of us. Last year we found a room, but we were evicted because they wanted to charge us more rent and we couldn't afford it. Sometimes we take a month to find a job because we don't own a car and we have to walk from place to place. Any money we save here, we use up there to eat and while we're still looking for work. And then if we don't work fast enough, they fire us. Still, we live better here because we have food to eat. In Mexico, that wasn't always the case. I'm afraid the government might think I'm too poor and deport me, or perhaps take my children away because they think I can't care for them. I wish we could get legal residence so that we could live in peace. I thought that was a really pretty incredible story. Can you imagine her and her 5 kids walking through the desert for 5 days? That's, sometimes people's courage, it just really kind of gets to you. At any rate, I think I'm going to stop here and just hopefully talk with you about what this project has to say. Well, usually what I do is, I sort of try to play the innocent in a way. So in most cases, I'll go into the field, and first you have to talk to the foreman who's in the field, because if you just start taking pictures without asking the foreman about it, he'll come right over right away and get angry at you because you've disrespected him. So, and the workers are also going to worry about you're taking pictures without asking the foreman first because they don't want to get in trouble cooperating with you if the foreman's going to get mad at them for doing that. So better to go and talk to the foreman first. And usually what I'll do is, I discovered, at first I was very, very, very kind of like nervous about the whole thing because I remembered my experience as a union organizer, which is when you go into the field, in almost all cases, the foremen start, they don't want you there, and so it's a fight from the very beginning. But I discovered that actually, even though there are some questions about being a photographer, that it's a lot easier talking to the foreman than being a union organizer, because being a union organizer is obviously threatening. And a photographer, a lot of times what the foreman's really worried about is, are you going to do something that's going to get me in trouble? Is there something illegal going on in this field that I should worry about that you're going to take a picture of? So like if there's kids working, that's going to be an issue right there. But what I'll usually do is I'll say to the foreman, this is about the Mixteco community here. I know that there are Mixtecos working in your crew. We have this documentary project about the life of Mixteco people in California here, and people's work life is part of the project, and so we want to be able to include it and show the dignity of people's work and that people are hard workers. And a lot of times foremen themselves were workers before, and so when you talk about the dignity of work or people's culture, sometimes it's happened that the foremen themselves are Mixteco or Purépecha or from the indigenous group that we're talking about. And so the foremen themselves want to participate in a way in the documentation. That doesn't always happen. Once in a while, especially in places where there are big companies, if it's a crew working for a big company, a lot of times the foreman will say, I got to check with the office, at which point you know that you're lost. Because if it goes any higher in the hierarchy, then the foreman right there on the spot, whoever it is that they talk to is going to say no. So you've got to really convince the foreman right there on the spot that it's okay and nothing bad is going to happen. To my big surprise, actually, most of the time it works. The thing about farm labor is that it's way out there in the open. I was a factory worker myself for many, many years, and factories are really different. With a gate and a door, you can't go in. There is no such thing as open access. But a field is a little different. A field's like way out there in the middle of, it's almost like a public area, kind of. And so you could, if you wanted to, just stand on the highway and take pictures with a telephoto lens. And the foreman knows that, and the workers know that. But in a way, doing it up close is kind of more personal. It's more respectful, I think, in some ways. You're not sort of like trying to take advantage of people by staying a long distance away and shooting pictures with a big telephoto lens. You're going up and talking to people and meeting with them. And once you get over you break the ice, a lot of times what happens is the people in the crew start to make fun of you. They'll start to tease you. They'll start to tease each other. They'll start to say, "Oh, take a picture of him," "Take a picture of her," or it all becomes a big game, kind of. You're an entertainment for half an hour. You're their entertainment in the middle of a boring workday. And so you have to kind of like play to your advantages, even if you have a serious purpose, or part of your purpose is a serious one that you don't want to tell them about. If what you're actually trying to do is document some of the difficulties and problems of working in that field, that's not what obviously you want to talk to the foreman about. On the one hand, I think that it's hard to. It's a political problem. So the first thing to say is we can't solve the problem without the workers themselves having more power, having more political power. I don't really think that we're going to be able to, even though CRLA has some very celebrated cases in which it's fought for better housing for people, for instance, living in trailer camps, and has gotten the county. I think in Coachella, I know that they've gotten the county to find new trailers for workers who were living in ones that were so broken down that they were against code. Or there was a famous instance in Fresno where there was a trailer camp that was on top of a toxic waste dump, and through legal action against Chevron Corporation, Chevron had to cough up enough money to basically buy workers, new homes. So I'm not saying that those things don't happen, but when you think about the fact that there are maybe, 250,000 farm workers in California, a sort of global solution requires that workers themselves have more power to enforce it. And I think actually during the years when the union was strong, the housing conditions and the wages for workers were better. And one of the reasons why we have housing problems for farm workers in California, is because the union isn't as strong as it used to be. So there's not as much pressure on the state authorities and on growers. Who should pay for it? I think it's a complicated problem. On the one hand, we need to pressure the state government and county governments to provide housing, especially for migrants, people who travel with the crops, because I think those are the people who have the hardest time finding a place to live during the times when they're traveling. But I don't necessarily see why taxpayers in California should subsidize growers. I really think that growers should be forced to pay for this. Jesus Estrada, who works for CRLA in Santa Maria and is also the the chairperson or the president of the chapter of the Frente Indígena in Santa Maria, was a strike organizer during, 1999, the year when the UFW had the main elections in Watsonville. They actually had a strawberry strike in Santa Maria to get the wages up. And, you can read on the text panel in the gallery Jesus' story, and I won't read it here, but it's very interesting to me that they did this using the existing network among Mixtecos, especially in that community. There were two organizations, the Frente Indígena and another one that was called Mixtecos Unidos, that essentially organized that strike. It had its cost, which was that the growers fired all the strike leaders. 180 people got fired and blacklisted. And Jesus would be the first person, in fact, he says so in this thing. We didn't really have the training to know where to go from here. In other words, having forced the wages up, but then having been fired and blacklisted, what do we do next? To me, that was a story of, on the one hand, that sort of shows you how organized the Mixteco community is, that they're capable of carrying off what would be, I think, a very challenging labor activity, even for an organized union to do. And they did it. But obviously, the resources of the community itself were limited, and its political power, the ability to get those people back into work, was limited. But the other thing that it showed to me was that, I spent all year when we were doing this project asking myself, how come there aren't quickie strikes about some of this stuff? Like the onions, for instance. The thing about the onions is that once the grower goes through the field with a disc and forces the onions up above the ground so that workers can pick them up and cut the tops and the bottoms off and put them in a bag, the onions have to be bagged within 24 hours or they're no good. So for a union, that is a great situation, because all you have to do is stay out on strike for 3 or 4 days, and that grower is in deep, deep, deep trouble. So I kept wondering, why don't we just have a quickie strike, get the piece rate up, double the piece rate? Maybe we won't get a union contract, but workers will really have a feeling of their own power, and I think that it is, there is union activity out there. The union does exist, but I think it's also, there are some problems, to be really honest about it, at least ones that I saw. And I'm a dyed-in-the-wool, I love the union, I worked for it for a long time, but I think, that we have to be honest about things. And one of them is that I don't think that the union really understands very well how to integrate itself into the indigenous communities that are working out there in the fields. I didn't see, for instance, a lot of organizers working for the union that spoke Mixteco, Triqui, Zapoteco, Chatino, and the rest of it. But more than that, like I was at the Guelaguetza in Fresno, where those pictures of the dancers were taken. And in my day, and this was happening while the union was, I think, 2 weeks away from the election in Delano. And they're not, Fresno and Delano are not that far distant from each other. And in our day, I think, Dorothy, we would have gone to the Guelaguetza and made a speech about, hey, come down to Delano, support the union, get involved, we want to be part of you and we want you to be part of us. And it was like 2 different things happening at 2 different places. So I think that, there are some problems that have to be worked on for the union to be able to grow again, and for workers to make the decision that this is really what they want to do, and that the union is an organization that really they feel belongs to them. But ultimately, however that question works out, I think that maybe it's just because I've been a union activist all my life, but to me that is the answer to it. That is how we get enough power as working people to change things like housing and bad wages, and the rest of it is by developing some organization among ourselves as workers that we can force the growers to do what we want them to do. And I think also, in a way, when we were talking about the housing problem, what the solution to the housing problem is, one of the reasons I think it's hard to kind of like pinpoint and zero in on the answer here is that the answer has actually come out of the workforce that is suffering this problem. It has to be an answer that seems rational to people that they themselves are willing to go and fight for. And that's not the case yet. So, to the extent that that happens, I think that we'll be that much closer to finding a solution to that problem. Rufino Dominguez, who is the head of the Frente Indígena and was the first community worker in the Indigenous Farm Worker Program for CRLA, was a strike organizer among farm workers in Sinaloa and then in Baja California, and came to California with a very rich experience as an organizer, knowing how to do that. Fausto Sanchez, who runs the office in Lomont, another person who organized strikes in Baja California. Jesus Estrada, organized strikes here in Santa Maria. There is a lot of knowledge among Mixtecos and indigenous farm workers in California about how to organize in that way. I don't think that there's a huge lack of knowledge or of leadership. I think that it is a more complicated problem, and I'm not sure that I know exactly what the answer to it is. But I've asked Rufino myself, why aren't you trying? Jesus at the end of his thing says, "I think we need a union. I want to go out and organize a union." Rufino is kind of more. Rufino, don't we need to have a union? Well, yeah, but it's like there are other questions that have become more important. And so one of the things that happened to me doing this project, and also the one that came before it, was, I was a union organizer, a labor guy for a long time, 2.5 decades. And so my first reaction to everything is, let's organize ourselves as workers, we'll go out on strike. No. And also underneath that is, the economics of our lives is what determines most of who we are. Whether we're workers or we're not workers, or whether workers are bosses, or all the rest of it. And when I started doing this project, what I really had to learn was that there is a role that culture plays in people's lives that is way beyond just a kind of mechanical view of class. Class is a very important issue, and these are very important lens through which you look at the world, and I still look at the world through that way. But I think that some of the most hard-fought things that the Mixteco and Triqui and Zapoteco community does here in California have to do, for instance, with language rights. CRLA and the Mixtecos won the right to Mixteco translation in California courts when people didn't have it in Oaxaca. I met this guy, Fausto Lopez, who was the head of the Sonoma County chapter of the Frente Indigena, who was living in a tent beside the Russian River and working as a farm worker, and who talked all about how he had worked for a long time in Baja California. He had his family there, his wife and his kids got to a certain age where it was very important to him that they learn to speak Triqui. And they had fought as a community for bilingual education in the Baja schools in San Quintin, and to a certain extent had won some of that. And he said, but my kids are not going to learn the culture this way. They might learn the words, they might learn some of the language, but they are not going to learn the culture. They have to go back home and live there. And so he sent his family back to Oaxaca, and he came to the United States to work as a farm worker in order to send them back money and support them. That is an enormous sacrifice. It's not just the money part of it, it's also the loneliness, it's the separation. And so I think that culture plays an incredibly important role in the lives of these communities. And I think, the more I look at it, the more I begin looking at the rest of the world and trying to figure that one out too. What role does culture play in the role of people like me that grew up as a white kid in Oakland? What is my culture? I would have a hard time answering that question. In a way, I think Mixtecos have a big advantage over me, because I think if I ask you, what is the culture, what is Mixteco culture, people can say, yes, it's the language, it's the dances, it's the food. Yeah.
They recognize you.
If you say, what is the culture of a white kid growing up in Oakland, I guess I would start talking about my parents having been union organizers, and it would just collapse into class really fast. Because I think in this country, we have become, we live in a racist country, and we recognize that. And so part of that is, if you belong to the dominant culture, you don't want to identify with that aspect of the culture that is kind of like lording it over the culture of everybody else, especially that part of it that is involved in the mass production of culture, Disney or television or whatever, if you can even call that a culture that belongs to you as an individual. So I think that makes it a much more complex question, and I think that's one reason why, you know, a Oaxacan community like the community in Santa Maria can come together and organize a strike and get the wages up, even at a pretty high cost. If those were, you know, a field full of white kids from Oakland, I think that it would be much harder to do because we don't have the same kind of cultural glue that holds us together as people and a sense of commonality with each other other than the class things. So, you know, it's really, to me, it's been a tremendous learning experience doing this project. You know, forcing me as a photographer and a writer and a social activist to look at questions that I just sort of blew past real fast during the time that, you know, I worked as a organizer, and now I'm sort of coming back and revisiting them. And because of trying to figure out what role culture plays in these communities, you know, I think for any honest person it makes you ask, okay, well then what is your culture? What role is culture playing in your life? Who are you in relation to this? So I don't have any good answers to that, but I just, you know, the questions are really important questions. Well, to begin with, you know, I think the Bracero experience was very, 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 very important for many, many, many families here in the U.S. and in Mexico. And in this book, there's a whole section on the Bracero experience, you know, in which, well, I won't start telling these stories here, but there's some pretty fascinating stories in there. And so people have had this both idea and practice of coming to the U.S. and working for a season for a long time. The Bracero program, that was a mandatory way of working. You know, there was no other option so long as you were in the program, because you had to leave after 10 months, period. And sometimes before. Some workers left the program and kind of walked away from it and stayed here as undocumented. And there was a whole mixture during those times of people who were sometimes braceros and people who were sometimes undocumented. And you know that song Deportee, the Woody Guthrie song, you know, I don't want to start singing for you, but you know, all they will call it. It tells the story of the airplane as it was flying over Los Gatos Canyon near Coalinga, and the airplane explodes, and you know, Woody Guthrie talks about, you can see the people falling like leaves, and it's basically about an air crash of a plane that is carrying workers back to the border who were caught as undocumented workers during that Bracero time. And the song says, you know, they treat us like outlaws, like wrestlers, like thieves. That's sort of like the chorus of the song. And so what growers were doing in that plane was what they called, in the vernacular of the day, they were drying out the wets. So what growers would do is they would take workers who were working for them as undocumented, and they would then drop a dime on their own workers, have them deported back to the border, then sign them up as braceros, and they would go back and work in the same field. So people kind of like went back and forth and back and forth. In fact, I think that's one reason why in some communities here, when we've been looking at these proposals in Congress for guest worker programs, you know, some people are sort of saying to themselves and remembering that history and saying, well, we could live with it because, you know, we could always walk away from the program, and, you know, sometimes we'll be, you know, guest workers and sometimes we won't. I think that is a real illusion. I think the world has really changed, and they're going to make it practically impossible for people to walk out of that program if they are successful in reestablishing it on a really large scale, larger than what already exists right now. But be that as it may, you know, it's part of the consciousness of our community, is that whole experience there. But I think there's also another part of the experience that is worth thinking about, and that is that remember those families that are living here now whose parents and grandparents were braceros. What happened to the thinking in that family in the years after people stopped being braceros? And a lot of what it was people stop thinking of themselves as really living in San Juan Mixtepec. I live in Los Angeles now. So for a while you think to yourself, I really am living in Oaxaca. I'm really living in Jalisco. I'm just here to work. I'm just here to work and send back my, and in a way, that I think is what makes living on a hillside in San Diego bearable, part of it. Because you're saying to yourself all the time, I'm just here for a while. I can deal with it. I can bear anything. I can make any sacrifice for my family because I know that I'm not really here. I'm really there. But, life changes people, right? You fall in love, you get married, you have children. Children are born here. I've interviewed lots and lots of people now, and I have yet to meet anybody that has told me, my kids, they're living here now, but they will eventually live in Mexico. Every, without exception, people say, yeah, my kids are going to live here. Some people say, well, when I retire, I'm going to go back, and I'll live there because I won't have to work anymore. And if I have a green card, I can come back and forth and, see my kids and then go back home and live. Some people say, well, maybe I'll go back and visit. People send their kids back during the summers so that they can get to know the place that they come from, but nobody expects that the kids are going to live there, which is a problem. If you want your kids to speak Triqui like Fausto wanted his kids to speak Triqui, the sacrifice you have to make to have your kid grow up in your hometown essentially means that you are not going to live with them. So the separation of families is a real, it's a real sacrifice that people make. And ultimately, families get separated, and those separations never do get resolved, healed. I think that the families that are separated by migration will always be separated until, the relationship becomes very distant. Your cousins or your second cousins or your third cousins are still living at home. Their second cousins or the third generation is living here. But how do you keep your culture under those circumstances? How do you make sure that your kids speak Triqui and know the dances and can cook mole and, have a sense of collective responsibility to your community the way people in, small towns in Oaxaca do? Hard questions to figure out. I was having a really interesting conversation with somebody in the gallery about Chinese immigrants to the United States, because one of the ways that Chinese families deal with this, and have since the 1800s, is what's called Chinese school. Right? If you are, when you're in elementary school, by the time you get to about third grade, you get sent to Chinese school after school. You get an additional 2 hours of school every day, and kids just complain like hell about it. But
And it's the same for the Japanese. They go to Saturday school.
Saturday school.
Jewish kids.
Yeah, yeshiva, right? Well, I'm waiting to. I keep asking in some of these interviews about is there a Mixteco school? Is there a Triqui school that because there are some communities. There are 3,000 Triquis that live in Greenfield. That's enough families, enough people to actually have a. Right, we were having this conversation about it. Right?
And I thought, just now when you mentioned that, because I recently read a piece of writing by an organization who works, this problem of really taking a community from the agricultural arena in one country and transplanting it in another one. And one of the things that they were talking about is how we really have to open up to new possibilities, because that's in a way what globalization is doing to those communities, giving them new opportunities to reconstitute or to disappear. And one of the things that's happening in San Diego that never ceases to amaze me, it's like I live in Mesa, which is a very recent immigrant community. The people have lived there for a long time. And today in Mesa, you can hear Maya Quiche, something that in Mexico City would be hard. you could not find the Maya Quiche in Mexico City. So this is something that the communities have to rethink and face, because like you're saying, when I was growing up, and I'm not that old, it wasn't allowed in Mexico City for someone to continue on with their traditions, and they were highly encouraged to forget their tradition. So now these people have this opportunity here simply because others ignore them. Nobody even knows in Mira Mesa what are these people speaking. They don't know. They think it's Mexican. They think many things, but they don't know it's Maya Quiche. So when communities are living in that new reality, then they're going to realize that, hey, we're free to speak our language, we're free to communicate.
Well, I think that's a very optimistic point of view, and I think that it's true that that new possibilities exist, that this creates new possibilities, but communities have to want it. There's nothing guaranteed that your culture will survive, right? Nobody's making any promises to anybody. So if a community wants this culture to survive, it has to take some step to make it happen. And sometimes it's not clear to me what the step is. It's not so much that the people who grew up in Chiapas or in the Yucatan speaking Maya Quiche are going to stop speaking it when they come here. To me, it's more, the question is more, are your children going to speak it? Are their children going to speak it? And if your answer to that question is yes, they are, then what are you going to do as a community to make sure that that happens? Because the whole pressure of the culture on your kids, they're going to go to school, they're going to learn English, they're going to learn English first, Spanish second, and Maya Quiche at home if you make them. It's hard to figure out what is the pressure that goes against that. What's the countervailing pressure that does that? Like those dance groups, to me, that's part of what some communities are coming up with. It's in a way, it's like the Chinese school. We are going to have our kids come together a couple of times a week. They're going to practice the dances. Maybe we'll make sure that we're talking in Mixteco while we're doing it. And it will be tied together with events and fiestas where we will cook the food that we're used to. And there's another text panel in the gallery by this Purepecha couple that talk about the Purepechas. And in a way, they're actually pretty well, even better organized, I think, in some ways, because they have an organization. They have La Nación Purepecha, which is a very organized group in Mexico and here. But at any rate,